that there was a degree of annoyance from the EU that India did not name and shame Russia in the beginning. Now that President Trump is saying the same thing, frankly, and they realize, I think India probably is suffering more by not having that FTA. Europe is a much larger entity, and maybe they could have lived with it without the FTA. But I think it was in our interest to do the FTA.
So the European commissioners are in India, the entire senior leadership of the European Union, led by President Ursula von der Leyen, coming here for a big meeting with the Indian government and with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. It's a difficult time for Europe, but an interesting time for the India-Europe relationship. Joining me now to discuss what exactly the European commissioners want to achieve here in India, what the India-EU relationship is going to be all about, is Ambassador Mohan Kumar, a diplomat with years and years of experience, both in Europe and with issues like international trade. Ambassador Kumar, thank you so much for joining us. Could you give us a sense of just the setting of this meeting between India and the European Union, the entire senior leadership of the European Union, 27 commissioners, and the President of the European Commission here in India? What exactly is prompting this big visit?
Thank you very much. So this visit was scheduled some time back, so I cannot really say that this visit is in reaction to what happened at the Munich Security Conference and events of the last 2 weeks, when the transatlantic relationship has been shattered by the President of the United States. He has made some comments about the EU and so on. So you cannot say this visit is directly in response to it. But every visit takes place in a geopolitical context, as you hinted. And I think for me, the EU-India relationship hitherto makes me say three things. One, there was a roadmap which was agreed in 2020, which is supposed to go on till 2025. The best thing I can say is we should just throw it in the bin. That roadmap is simply not valid at all. In any case, it was only supposed to be till 2025. So we were looking at a roadmap which was completely obsolete. That's one. Second, I think this is one strategic partnership. I would have to use the word underwhelming or underexploited. And I think even the Europeans will agree with my characterization of this strategic partnership. I think both sides have failed to exploit the full potential of this relationship. And there should be a recognition of this on both sides as they meet today, because it's only if you recognize that you've not done well that you can really try to address the issues surrounding the relationship. Third, I would say Ursula von der Leyen actually started off the first time saying she will have a geopolitical commission. I did not see too much evidence of that.
Right.
I sincerely hope this time we will see not just a geopolitical commission, but we will also see a geopolitical India negotiating with the EU, which means you cannot be obsessed with alcoholic beverages. You cannot be exercised about auto parts. You're missing the wood for the trees if you do that.
Right.
There is a larger picture. The big picture is you've got the President of the United States who has brought a wrecking ball to the liberal international order. He's completely changed the dynamics of relationship with Russia. We don't know what line he will take against China. In the light of this, it makes eminent sense for India and EU to try and see if they can insulate themselves from this geopolitical uncertainty to the extent possible. I'm, of course, happy to expand in your further questions about what precisely they should do, but I did want to kind of paint the geopolitical canvas or the geopolitical backdrop against which this visit is happening. It is unprecedented. All 27 commissioners may not be here. 23 of them are here. The fact that she has come with a college of commissioners is certainly unprecedented and certainly is testimony to the importance that EU attaches to its relationship with India.
Right. Could I also ask you a little bit about something very interesting that you said about the partnership being underexploited. In fact, I was going through President Ursula von der Leyen's speech or just now that has just been released, and she also said that, look, this is a partnership that has barely scratched the surface. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Why exactly has this partnership underperformed? There have been talks of a strategic partnership back since the early 2000s. Why exactly has it taken 20 years for the two sides to really start looking at each other?
Yes, some structural reasons and some specific dossier which have failed to move forward. On the structural reasons, you have to bear in mind, Shashank, that India has always dealt with France, Germany, and the individual member states, now Italy, which has become very important, and so on. So we've always found it, I think, swifter, easier, nimbler just to deal with the member states. The Commission came into being later. So our strategic partnership with the EU, for example, dates much later than the strategic partnership with France. So that is the structural reason. The other reason is really about competence. Competence is such a loaded word in the EU. They
Right.
have exclusive competence for some areas, they have mixed competence for some areas, and they have some other thing which is called guidance competence. So our problem is sometimes we don't know whether mobility of professionals is really exclusive competence or mixed competence. Investment, for example, if you take the issue of investment, while negotiating investment treaties is exclusive competence of the Commission, so we can do that. But the very important aspect of investor state dispute settlement mechanism, which is part of the investment agreement, that is something that falls under the member states. So there are structural reasons why it's difficult to do business with Brussels. I don't mean to point fingers because we also have a bureaucracy, but then I'm just saying there are some structural reasons. The
Right.
other reason why it is underexploited, frankly, both sides have to take the blame. The free trade agreement should have been done years ago.
Right.
We missed the bus. And when I say we, I'm saying collectively both missed the bus. But I have to be honest with you. I think India probably is suffering more by not having that FTA. Europe is a much larger entity, and maybe they could have lived with it without the FTA. But I think it was in our interest to do the FTA. We missed the bus. Now an FTA has been launched in 2022, and I think we should really, really wrap this up, and I'm happy to address the specific issues.
Right.
The third reason why it is underexploited is a typical reason. The trade and technology partnership gets established in 22.
Right.
You have a first meeting in February 23 or May 23. The three working groups meet, and then radio silence. Nothing. The second meeting of the Trade and Technology Council is going to happen now in Delhi. So you cannot, in today's age, have a gap of 2.5 years for a forum to meet.
Right.
You simply have to meet every 6 months. You find the resources. If you don't have the people, hire people. And so both sides have to get their act together.
Understood.
We cannot establish a forum and then forget about it for 2 years and then wait for the College of Commissioners to come to Delhi and then have the meeting. That's simply not on. At a time when everybody is going after resilient supply chains and technology transfer and so on. So for a variety of reasons, the relationship is underexploited, but I think that is water under the bridge. Nothing can be done about it. But I think what we should now really do is realize that every crisis offers an opportunity. There is a geopolitical crisis for sure, whichever way you look at it in the world, but that crisis offers an opportunity. And I think both sides should grab the opportunity with both their hands.
Understood. So let me try to draw you in on some of the things that you've mentioned. You were widely recognized as one of the Foreign Service's best experts on trade. You were at the World Trade Organization as well. Could you tell us a little bit about the trade question? Because as a journalist, I've been covering this since I got into the profession. This idea of the India-EU free trade agreement, there was a lot of optimism about it. And then somewhere, perhaps 18 months ago, there was this increasing sense that the more headlines you read, the more you got the sense that the thing is stuck and it's very, very hard. The Europeans want a deep agreement that covers a wide swathe of things. India would be has been asking for compromises on key issues. There's been this issue of CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Could you help untangle this for us? Because on the surface, to our audience, it would look like it makes a lot of sense for India to have a trade agreement with the world's largest bloc, but it just hasn't worked out that way. Could you break that down for us? What exactly is going on here?
Yes, happy to do that. So when you talk of an FTA these days, or even in the past, you have to recognize there are various elements that constitute an FTA. I will begin with tariffs. So that's the one which is recognized by everybody. So there are tariffs, and for a select group of items, which should constitute ideally most of your trade, you try to bring down the tariffs. Two problems. India has been relatively a country which has high tariffs, and it does that to protect its domestic industry and also for revenue purposes, less and less for revenue, more and more for protection. India also has a basic duty and then imposes special cess on that duty. So that also complicates life for its trading partners. EU itself is not exactly an angel in the sense of some select items from India have not been able to access EU. For example, the generalized system of preferences does not apply to India, GSP. It applies to Pakistan, it applies to Vietnam, it applies to Bangladesh, it applies to Sri Lanka. You can easily imagine that our garment manufacturers will find it difficult to compete with Bangladesh, Vietnam, Pakistan, Sri Lanka if they have tariff benefits and you don't. So there are problems on both sides that need to be tackled on tariffs. That's the first. Second, and perhaps on tariffs, I must also mention that the tariffs on wines and spirits are traditionally high because India follows the system of what is known as a sin tax. These are goods which are considered, in any case, it's not 70% of India that consumes French wine, right? You and I might have a glass of wine, but not the 80-90% of the people. So it's thought convenient for the Indian Finance Ministry to say, okay, let me increase the duty on wines. That is precisely what the EU wants as well. So that is something that we need to negotiate with them. On auto parts, it's somewhat more complicated in the sense that ideally the EU would also like to export automobiles to India. But then we have massive investment from Hyundai and Honda and Kia and so on. Those investments in India are predicated on these duties continuing. Because otherwise, what is the incentive for them
to come here and manufacture
vehicles in India? So you have that issue as well, which needs to be negotiated. The second element in an FTA is non-tariff barriers. Both countries have non-tariff barriers. If you ask me, I'm extremely worried about my Alfonso mangoes not reaching EU because they want to test it, and then testing takes time, or one mango has some germs and the whole consignment gets rejected. That's one. Buffalo meat, same problem. Pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals should be approved as expeditiously as possible. And India has for years been arguing that US and EU cannot play this game, that if the US approves a drug, the EU should automatically approve it because everybody knows the US Federal Drug Agency is quite strict and vice versa. But that doesn't happen. Even for a drug which is approved by the US Federal Drug Agency, I still have to go to the EU and I have to wait for approval. So those approvals need to be done expeditiously if Indian exports have to find a foothold in EU. Similarly, for EU, agriculture is extremely important. They want access to the growing Indian agriculture and dairy market. But you know, and I know, that these are virtually politically sensitive and untouchable subjects in India. So that is a decision that the government has to take as to how much they can reduce the tariffs on agriculture products and dairy products. So, and also about non-tariff barriers in those areas, because no agricultural export can happen without testing, without food safety standards. They become important. So that's the second thing I want to say. The third thing I want to say really about the FTA is that ultimately both sides will gain from an FTA only if there are deep reforms in India which address land, labor, and logistics. It's only then that you will get massive investment. FTAs are supposed to bring investment to India and to EU as well, but more to India than to EU. And India has been missing out on this aspect, not because the FTAs were bad, but because we haven't been able to do the deep-seated, difficult reforms. You know, the
Right.
low-hanging fruits are easy to pick,
Sure.
but the deep-seated reforms have been more difficult. So the FTA story is not easy. And my line to you, at the risk of being, dubbed as someone who's going to make a controversial statement, I have to say this. If you leave it to the civil servants on both sides, this will go on for years and years. I would argue that for some of these issues, not all, but some of these issues, the political leadership on both sides have to get involved.
Right.
Which is why my proposal is really for a minister on either side to be appointed exclusively for the India-EU relationship, who will monitor this issue every 3 months.
Right.
It cannot be that both sides get together once in 2, 3 years and then talk about it and then forget about it. You need some ministerial level envoy, somebody who has close ties with the Prime Minister's office, who has close ties with the Commerce Ministry, Finance Ministry, External Affairs, to do this on a daily basis. That is how the EU-India FTA can be cracked. If you leave it only to the civil servants, I'm afraid, and I'm not blaming the civil servants. If you don't give them enough authority, and if they don't have the leeway, then you can't expect them to conclude. The conclusion, the tough decisions, at least in India, and I suspect also in the EU, can only be done by the political leadership, not the civil servants.
Right.
So that's what I would say.
I understand. And let me pay you a compliment by saying that I've covered this issue for 2.5 years, and I think no one has encapsulated the problems better in that 4-minute span than you have. Let me ask you a little bit about defense as well. I personally can say that I've been traveling in Europe a little bit recently, and you can see from a number of European defense ministers, there has been the sense that, look, we need to rearm quickly. We need a stronger defense and security partnership with India. In fact, the Ursula von der Leyen, in a speech that has just been released, has said that India and the European Union are going to look at establishing a security partnership that is similar to what the European Union has with Japan and South Korea. From my personal travels, I could see, for example, that in Estonia, for example, they want they're on the border with Russia. They want artillery with France. We just saw that the Prime Minister went there and he invited the French government to look at India's Pinaka multi-barrel rocket launchers. So there has been the sense that India can get in on the ground floor of this new European rearmament that seems to be discussed a lot, even if it isn't entirely in the making. Could you break that down for us? Is there an opportunity for India here to assist in the rearmament of Europe as it deals with an America that is less interested in providing for European security and a Russia that is finally tasting some success in the Ukraine war? What are you thinking?
So two fundamental points. One is that defense policy of the European Union is work in progress. It's not as if the member states have given away their exclusive power on defense issues to Brussels. So you need to keep that in mind, because I can only negotiate if the EU has exclusive competence on defense. It doesn't. That's why we deal with France, we deal with Germany, we deal with Italy, and so on. So that issue needs to be kept in mind as EU becomes more and more, or as EU proceeds closer to a common security and defense policy in practice, not just on paper. Once that happens, I think we can deal. Having said that, I do see a difference between land borders and maritime security. On maritime security, I would say EU and India should be automatic partners. On the land, it's difficult, which is why we have to go to France. And Indian Ocean, we sometimes go to France, we buy Rafale and so on. But maritime security, if we can get the EU to fully implement its outlook on Indo-Pacific, where there is a lot of reference to Indian Ocean.
Right.
You know that in the Indo-Pacific, the US, Japan, and Australia are heavily invested in the Western Pacific, but they're not as equally invested in the Indian Ocean. So we need partners like France, we need partners like EU. I'm particularly happy that the EU has released a position paper on Indo-Pacific. It's very brief, it needs to be fleshed out, but I think EU, India, maritime security, an absolute yes. That is where we should begin our concrete cooperation. And then by the time EU, if it's able to make progress on its common security defense policy as member states hand over maybe more power to Brussels, then we can think of cooperation on tanks and artillery and so on. And I must also say there right now is a bad time for that kind of security because they are caught up so much in the war in Ukraine that it's unfair to expect the Commission to do, weapons, traditional security, and so on. I think we should begin with maritime security. You could also begin with non-traditional security. What I mean by non-traditional security for your viewers, traditional security would be guns, artillery, and shells. Non-traditional security would be cyber security, public health security, for example, and things like undersea optic cables, the fiber optic cables that carry internet. Those are extremely in climate change, energy security. All this is non-traditional security.
Right.
And non-traditional security, EU are leaders. And I would love for EU and India to focus on maritime security and non-traditional security, try to build up trust, confidence, work out a good program, and then move towards traditional security at a later stage.
Understood. And there was another interesting thing that has come up throughout this conversation about a closer India-EU partnership, which is the India-Middle East Economic Corridor. That is something that was announced with great fanfare at the G20 in September 2023. We've just seen, again, I keep quoting from Ursula von der Leyen's speech, but she just called it a golden road, this potential corridor that can link both continents. But there's, of course, been significant speculation about how the IMEC will be implemented, and especially after the goings-on in West Asia since October 7, 2023. Lots of questions about whether something like this, or at least the Middle Eastern aspect of this corridor, is really something that is doable. Could you lay the groundwork and explain to us the need for increased connectivity, where IMEC fits in, how realistic the proposals really are, and whether we're likely to see some movement on this going forward now that we've seen some sort of ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war? Over to you.
So I have to say, in every joint statement that India has concluded with the European Union, you will find a paragraph on connectivity. So connectivity is an article of faith for the European Union. India took some time joining that game, but I think India is now a convert, a complete convert to EU's mantra on connectivity. Before I address the specific corridor of IMEC, let me also say that EU's agenda, which is a soft power agenda, is that India stands to benefit from connectivity even in its neighborhood. And EU is perfectly happy to help India. For example, if you want to do something in Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, you could have triangular cooperation between EU, India, and the country concerned. So EU has always had this perspective that if you have connectivity in a region like South Asia where there are divisions, it helps. And I have to give full credit to EU. They believe it as an article of faith. Coming to IMEC, I am absolutely convinced that IMEC will be a game changer. There are short-term obstacles. We shouldn't worry too much about it. Those obstacles are three. One, obviously, is the warlike situation in Gaza. I don't think we should worry about it. As you rightly said, it's not going to last forever. Positions taken by countries like Egypt and Turkey, again, we should not bother because I don't think they can have a veto on the IMEC. Last but not least, I'm particularly happy that countries like UAE, for example, France and India, we have started looking at IMEC, and UAE, for example, if I'm not mistaken, has appointed a special envoy.
Right.
And I think that's what India should do as well. If we want IMEC to be taken seriously, I think we should start doing things as if IMEC will exist. Don't wait for the Gaza war to get over. At some point it will. But UAE is doing a lot of things as if the war has ended in the Middle East. That's the right approach for India as well. Don't wait for the Gulf situation to stabilize. That might take time. I'm sorry, the Middle East. But I think meanwhile, India should do the things that it is meant to do in terms of the development of ports, the development of roads, the logistics, so that we get our internal act together. And when the time is right, we can just go ahead and do it. So I do set great store by IMEC. While I've heard now and then some people saying, oh, this is unfortunate, the Gaza happened, most people who are serious observers of connectivity, they tell me in the medium term, IMEC will be an excellent proposition. So we should take it very, very seriously. I missed it, but I'm happy to hear you say that Ursula von der Leyen made a reference to it. Absolutely. I think India, EU should push this IMEC. This is extremely important.
Right. So if I could ask you one last question, which is on an issue that has dominated the India-EU relationship really over the last 3 years, just the war in Ukraine. I think that most of our viewers will not be surprised to know that there has been a difference of opinion on the conflict. You, of course, traveled greatly in Europe, and you will, of course, know that European nations would have liked India to take a different position on Ukraine. India has made its position, although clear. Do you think that it will have any lasting repercussions for the India-Europe relationship, or are all sides basically mature and grown up, and that Europe understands India's position and they understand that circumstances have changed, the India relationship is important, we have to let the Ukraine war be in the past as an issue that has perhaps deterred strategic cooperation between India and the EU? What do you think about that?
My sense is that Europe will put it behind them. It is true that there was a degree of annoyance from the EU that India did not name and shame Russia in the beginning. But I think the moment the Indian Prime Minister started telling Putin and others this is not the era of war and that we have to find a diplomatic solution, now that the President Trump is saying the same thing, frankly, and they realize, I think if the Europeans do a serious introspection, they will come to the conclusion that this war has really led to avoidable loss of life and property. It's very hard to escape that impression. Yes, Russia was an aggressor. Where I differ with the Europeans is that, yes, Russia violated the UN Charter. For me personally, that's true. Where I differ with the EU is that I don't think it was unprovoked. Russia was provoked plenty. And for that, you need to do a bit of historical assessment. But all that is water under the bridge. I do not believe that will cast a shadow on the EU-India relationship. If anything, I think what India has been saying for the last 2 years, which is that we really should find a diplomatic solution to the problem. You are not going to get a solution on the battlefield, has turned out to be true. So to conclude my comments, Shashank, unless you have a question, if I can just take 1 minute concluding. Look, we have a very, very complicated geopolitical scenario. Even without Mr. Donald Trump doing all the things he has done, even without it, it's complicated. In a situation like this, where everybody is hedging their bets, I personally believe EU and India have really found a geopolitical context which is perfect to do the things they have set out to do. My point to you, rhetorical, if you like, is that if an assertive China and an unpredictable United States does not bring EU and India together, I don't know what will. And let me conclude that.
Ambassador Mohan Kumar, thank you so much for your time. India's former envoy to France, as well as the World Trade Organization, really breaking down, if I may say so masterfully, or the problems that have been there on the India-EU Free Trade Agreement, some of the questions on defense, also the India-Middle East Economic Corridor, and also the big question of Ukraine and how the situation that we find ourselves in the world today is driving India and Europe together. Thank you again, Ambassador Kumar, for your time. Thank you so much for our viewers for joining us here on India Today Global.
Thank you.